managed to persuade his publishers to have his books printed at a press in London called the Chiswick Press. Chiswick is Chiswyck. The Chiswick Press was run by a family, by a couple of brothers, who understood good type and who, whenever possible, found better type than this to print their books with and took more time to do them. They often used hand presses. And Morris became a pain in the side to these people because he used to go down to the press works when his books were in the press and being printed and kibitz all the time. He'd talk about letter spacing and where the page should be broken and whether they should move this there and so on and so forth. He finally got banned from the press room because he was such a damn nuisance. But he nevertheless had an effect on the kind of work the Chiswick Press did. They did listen to him, and they became known fairly quickly, this would have been in the 1860s, 70s, as one of the better printers in London. People, if you wanted a really good-looking book, you went to the Chiswick Press. If you didn't, you ended up with something that looked like that. Morris was more and more intrigued. He was a calligrapher as well, I mentioned that, did I? He was a calligrapher. He was more and more intrigued by the quality, or the lack of quality, in the books that he saw, not only his own work, but other people's. And in 1889, he went to a lecture by a man named Emery Walker. And Emery Walker was a designer of printing equipment and photographic equipment. He was quite of a leading-edge, avant-garde kind of designer of the time. Brilliant engineer and brilliant scientist. And Emery Walker, as a hobby, collected Renaissance books, early printed books. And he gave a talk in Hammersmith, section of London. He gave a talk one evening about the typography of Renaissance books, and Morris went along because he was interested in letters and so on. He was so knocked out by the photographs, the lantern slides that Walker showed, that he sort of grabbed Walker after the lecture and walked home with him. And by the time they got back to Walker's place, they had agreed that they would start a press together, that Walker would tell Morris all that he needed to know about designing a type and would help Morris design it, do the drawings and everything that needed to be done, that they would find someone to cut the type, they would have it cast, and that Morris would start a press and he would print books with his type the old-fashioned way. And he did. From 1889 to 1896, when he died, so a period of 7 years, Morris's Kelmscott Press published 54 books, which is astonishing. Jan and I have been doing this since 1977. We've published 42 so far, and some of them are pretty small. Morris's were sizable, many of them. But it's important to realize that Morris himself didn't do the printing or the typesetting. He designed the type and he designed the books and he published them. But he had people he hired to do the printing and the press work, the composition. So it was possible for him to produce big books. Now, at the time this happened, there was no such printing going on anywhere else. Morris was the one who was, in England at least, Morris was the only one who was doing it. And when people who were book collectors and who had typically libraries of books that were hundreds of years old and so knew what good books looked like, saw Morris's books, they were delighted and they collected them, and they were expensive. And Morris, in effect, is the first private press printer in the modern private press movement. There were other similar privately owned presses before, but Morris's was really the one that first got it together. Now, his...
I'm going to grab his chair.
Good thinking, good thinking. Morris's work was famous for a lot of things. First of all, he produced copies of the canon, that is the standard, the great works of English literature. Shakespeare, Keats, Shelley, who were almost his contemporaries, Swinburne, who was his contemporary, Tennyson, who was as well. Books from the 14th and 15th century he had reprinted, things like Froissart's Chronicles of the French and English wars. He was interested in, he was a sort of a post-Gothic type. He was interested in the medieval period. It was his particular love. And his favorite poet, or one of his favorite poets, was Chaucer. And the last book produced during his lifetime at the press was a collected works of Chaucer. Now, most of the pages of the book look like this. This is Morris's type. This is a facsimile, this isn't an original. This is Morris's type. You can see it's kind of old-fashioned looking. I'll carry it around because it's very heavy. You can see the letter forms are, kind of deliberately archaic, but beautiful. And when you get used to it, and it doesn't take long to get used to it, they're quite easy to read. You got the shot? You can look at it later on the table. It'll be sitting there. He also designed all these little capital letters, and these were all carved in wood. But these are not the pages that people think about when they think about William Morris. What they think about when they think about William Morris often is a page like the opening page of the Chaucer, which is maybe the most famous page in modern book history, which is here. Now this is, everything on this page, except the picture, is designed by Morris. He designed the type, he designed and cut these drop caps, he drew and designed and had printed photographically, or made photographic plates for these blocks, and this, everything else. This is a case of one sensibility, one mind, one person, directing the entire process. It's like somebody who writes the music, conducts the orchestra, directs for an opera, does everything. This is what Morris did with this. Now, this is his biggest book, and his most famous one, and the last one, the sort of magnum opus of the press. And it's revered as one of the great works, one of the great books in European history. It's also reviled by a lot of people as a book which is completely unreadable, over-decorated, drawing attention to itself, doesn't care about the text, it only cares about showing off, on and on and on, right? You can imagine, you can see the argument both ways, right? It's undeniably beautiful, but how readable is it? Well, for someone like me, it's fairly readable. For someone like Amy, it might not be, because you're a lot smaller than I am, and how are you going to hold it to begin with? I mean, I sit in a big chair like that one that you two are in, and I'm about the same size as the two of you put together, and I can read this quite comfortably, and I'm used to the type, and I read it happily. Of course, you also have to be able to read Middle English, because that's what it's written in, not modern English. It's a great book, by any account. But even at that point, when the private press movement was just starting and didn't even have a name, because nobody thought of it as a private press, it was just Morris's madness, even at that point, there were arguments against it. One of the people who argued against it most strongly was the man who actually bound Morris's books, a man named Thomas Cobden Sanderson, who was, and this is an original, Cobden Sanderson was a binder, he bound this, and he designed all the Kelmscott books. He'd known Morris for years. But Cobden Sanderson was as ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C, as Morris was aesthetic. That is, Morris liked fancy stuff, Cobden Sanderson liked it very plain and simple. This is, that was after Morris died, very few, 3 or 4 years after Morris died. Cobden Sanderson started a press of his own, which he called the Doves Press, named after the house he lived in, which was the Doves down in Hammersmith. And the great work of the Doves Press, which ran from 1901 to 1916, the great work of the Doves Press was this, the Doves Bible. This is the King James Bible. And the famous page in this is also the opening page of Genesis. In the beginning. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and so forth and so on. This is the most decorative page in the whole book, in the whole 5 volumes. It's not the only page with second color, because every book of the Bible, second book of Moses called Exodus, every book of the Bible starts with a drop cap, like that. And the Psalms, of which there are 150 in the book of Psalms, each psalm begins with a slightly smaller drop cap in red, but that's it. That's the only decoration there is. The rest of the book is just beautifully set pages of straightforward prose, blocks of type. One size of type, one color, apart from the red drops, and that's it. Nothing more. Bound in plain vellum, on beautiful paper, magnificently printed. Now to me, Morris, I can understand people saying Morris is a little too ornate. Sometimes I feel the same thing. I find Cobden Sanderson's work chilly. I want to put on an extra sweater when I read it. It just doesn't somehow have the no, sweetie, not the claws. It doesn't somehow have the human warmth that Morris's has, or that Finch has. The other great press of the first 3 was this one. God, this is heavy. This is the Ashendene Press, started by, you all know W.H. Smith, right? The bookstore, W.H. Smith. How many people don't know W? Does anyone here buy books? God almighty, they're all over the place. The airport, W.H. Smith. Anyway, it's a chain store. It's like what is the place? Black Lawn Books down in Mission. It's that kind of a. It's now unfortunately a kind of a junky chain store. But W.H. Smith, the original W.H. Smith, was a very fine bookstore in London, which not only sold very fine books, but also printed them. And this guy, John St. John Hornby, who was the proprietor of the Barbarian Press, ran the printing plant at W.H. Smith. And he had family money. He too decided that because he admired Morris and Cobden and Sanderson, that he was going to start his own private press, which he did. And he called it the Ashendene Press after his house, Ashendene House in Surrey. This is only one of his folios. His press ran from 1902 until 1935, so longer than either of the other two. And he produced quite a few more books than either of those. This is one of the folios. This is the minor poems of Edmund Spenser. The major poem being The Faerie Queen, which is another volume about that thick, more than this, but bound uniformly. These books are heavy duty. This is an oak board in here, wrapped in vellum with handmade paper, and lots of end leaves. And his books are printed in 3 colors. Well, there's one page that has just the 2. This wonderful blue and the red for the shoulder notes. You'll see. And of course black for much of the rest of it. The typeface is again designed not by him but for him by a man named Grayley Hewitt. Grayley Hewitt was the one who carved that in the beginning in the Dove's Press. Grayley Hewitt designed the typeface for Cobden Sanderson's, or for St. John Hornby's press. And this is the first of them, called Subiaco, named after a monastery in Italy where